This is the workshop, Marcos to Duterte, Transnational Organizing for Democracy in the Philippines.
You open water.
Oh,
No, we have water.
Thank you. So my name is Cindy Domingo, and I'm one of the co-editors of A Time to Rise, collection of memoirs of the Union of Democratic Filipinos, the KDP. And the three of us, were members of the KDP, and Lorante, who's taking our photographs, is also, and my friend here, Rene Ciria. And so this was a 20-year project that we finally finished, and they are personal recollections of our experiences and stories about being in the organization. It was a national organization that was founded in 1973 and completely disbanded in 1990. And so we would like to, what we want to do in this workshop is talk about, the KDP had a dual program. It had a support for Philippine Revolution, but more specifically during that period to overthrow the U.S. Marcos dictatorship, and for our task here to end U.S. support for the dictatorship, which lasted for 14 years in the Philippines. And the other side of our work was organizing for a socialist program here in the United States, and in particular, fighting discrimination that Filipinos face in education, their workplaces, their communities, in all facets of their lives. And so we conducted a number of campaigns in regards to that socialist program, organizing nurses, healthcare workers, around housing issues like the International Hotel, and also in Chinatown in Seattle. And so, today we want to focus on the transnational organizing that we did in relationship to the Philippines. Unfortunately, we were hoping that after the overthrow of the Marcos dictatorship, that would lead to long-lasting democracy, and as many of you know, that is not happening in the Philippines now. And so we want to talk about not only the organizing, but an analysis of politically what has transpired in the Philippines from the Marcos era to the current situation. And so we're honored here today to have Rene Ciria Cruz, who is the U.S. Bureau Chief, Inquirer.net, to give us that historical perspective all the way from the Marcos era to now. And again, Rene is one of the co-editors of A Time to Rise. And Edwin Batongbacal, who immigrated to this country in the 1980, and continues to do work around the Philippines. And he'll talk about more the organizing aspect of our work, the transnational character. And he continues to be active in organizing around the Philippines for Philippine democracy in the Filipino-American Human Rights Alliance, which is located here in the Bay Area. And then I can talk about some of the work that we've done in Seattle, Washington, as well as some tours that we've done of people from the Philippines to continue to educate in the Filipino community. And then we can open it up for discussion, all right? So, Rene Cruz.
Thank you very much for staying, even though it's the last day. Time to party, but yes, I think the most common, let me start by noting that the most common question people ask me, especially non-Filipinos, is that, what's with this guy Duterte? He's so vulgar, he has no filters, and why is he so popular? Meaning, the question is, what is it with Filipinos that he is so popular? Right? And it's true, his ratings are very high, 16 million people voted for him, pushing him to over the top to the presidency. But he started out as the mayor of Davao City in Mindanao, where he used strong-arm tactics to control crime and the proliferation of drugs, and mainly through death squads. And this proved very effective in that small city. He entered into an agreement with the New People's Army to maintain or limit their attacks on the government outside the city, in the countryside. In fact, he would even visit the New People's Army base during their anniversary, and say Mabuhay and NPA. So he brought this unconventional governing style in his campaign for the presidency, and that's based on that reputation of no-nonsense, common sense, efficiency, combined with his no filters, man of the street persona. It was a winning combination. Really very popular, 60 million voters, as I said. And currently, despite the signs of high-level corruption within his cabinet, the impunity among his officials, top officials, he's still very popular. And of course, begs the question of, well, what is it with the national psyche that lets him get away with this, that made him president in the first place? So there's something definitely deeper in the national psyche or the political culture that undergirds this current popularity. It's the same political culture that led to the election as president of a popular movie star, Joseph Estrada, who then brought the government into scandalous levels of corruption, mainly because he had, in his movies, had the image of every man, the underdog, fighter for the masses, like that. So what is this undergirder? Let me use Professor Randy David's thesis. Randy David is a popular columnist in our newspaper, the Daily Inquirer, and he was a professor of sociology at the University of the Philippines. He says that there has always been a streak of authoritarianism in the Philippine political culture. And this is overlaid with some kind of a trellis of American-introduced democratic values that has yet to firmly take root. So that's his encapsulated description of the Philippine political system. Let me tweak this a bit by adding a few more observations as we look back into the history to trace the roots of this current political culture that brought us Duterte. Pre-Hispanic Philippines was mainly, outside of Mindanao, was mainly a collection of villages, self-contained villages, that were semi-Hispanic, semi-Islamic, more animistic. It was only Mindanao that really was a consolidated Islamic society, being closer to the entry point of Islam from Indonesia, Borneo. So it was easier for Spanish colonialism to conquer the northern Philippines, beginning with Manila. But before the Spanish came, these villages were ruled by datus, rajas. They usually were in charge of wars. They were looked up to because they were strong men in leading wars. But they weren't necessarily authoritarian. They governed by, they legislated rules with a council of elders, respected elders, and they're usually they're usually, I think it's mostly by consultation and consensus. Now, they had certain privileges, mainly probably social privileges, like they can have more wives than one, that maybe some of the choicest lands. But it wasn't so clear-cut a hierarchical society. When Spanish colonialism came, it introduced two things. One, it developed this local elite into a principalia. Tax collectors, go-betweens between the local inhabitants and the Spanish authorities and the friars. Maybe through alliances that they built, like to divide one village against another. So essentially, and then this group of elite no longer was the same, had the same stature as the previous elite had. They still had a lot of respect, and added to that, the bonus of some economic and social privileges. They could live under the bells, for one, which is Soto, under the bells, which means that they could live in the choice areas nearest to the church, bringing them closer to God. And they had, they're invited to important events, balls like that, and they could probably skim off the taxes that they collected from the population. So now you had a new phenomenon, which is a hierarchy of privilege. So these people now are looked up to, not just because they were kind of like high up in the political, they had the more access to the political authorities. They also had more in terms of property and money. So then that developed into this for 300 years. That was the arrangement. When the Americans came, the Americans didn't necessarily change that social structure. They in fact developed this social structure into what we would call the comprador oligarchy. They maintained the status and trained the best of these people from the best of these people into their local, I would say their local puppets, essentially. Some of them were educated abroad, and they were groomed as members of the Philippine Assembly. So they took over the semi-independent governance of the Philippines. Again, they're still looked up to. And then the Spanish colonialism also introduced another thing, which was a messianic religion, which is very important in a combination of respected authority and an expectation of being saved, by somebody. So I think this is what then percolated into the current political culture. The appeal, the kind of like it's not okay. It's more like being drawn into authoritarian and strongman figures who are also seen as saviors. Essentially, that's the combination. Okay, well, the question is begged that. Oh, before I go on, I said so that even in the 20s and the 30s, when the Americans were still directly ruling the Philippines, you'd have scattered rebellions, like the Sacdelistas, the Colorums, peasant-based rebellion. And most of the time, their leaders were also seen as not just strong leaders, but also as divinely ordained. Okay. So, in fact, up to today, there is a cult called the Rizalistas, who revere the national hero, Jose Rizal, not just a national political hero, but as a reincarnation of Jesus. So what we have now is with Duterte, with this kind of like appeal as a common man, a record of efficiency because of strong arm methods. He is now called by his strongest supporters as Tatay Digong. Digong is the nickname, okay? Or our father Digong. Okay? His communications secretary, even just a couple of days ago, during his on the occasion of his birthday, even wrote that to him, Duterte was like Jesus. And he, the communications secretary, sees himself as an apostle. I would say that he nailed the metaphor. So it's safe to say that, you know, Duterte's popularity is based on his no-nonsense, extremely vulgar, so-called common man persona and a longing for a savior. The abiding influence of the streak of authoritarianism in the political culture and the messianic legacy of Christianity, Catholicism in particular. What the danger this represents is that it's a danger to the current democratic arrangement in the Philippines. The question also is begged that, well, if the Philippines has had such a long history of adoration of strongmen, how come only Marcos came out as the dictator, compared with Latin America, with a successions of dictators. And I think the answer there is because of American colonialism. The direct presence of the United States as a ruling force in the Philippines until the end of the Second World War inhibited the rise of individual domestic leaders that, even though they may be popular, even though they might have a certain charisma, and it's because the United States was bent on differentiating American imperialism from the other imperialisms of the French, English party. Remember, benevolent assimilation is that campaign to differentiate American colonialism in the Philippines, to portray it as the showcase of democracy in Asia. The only other time that the United States government actively promoted the man of the masses image of a president was during Ramon Magsaysay's administration. It was the time of the communist-led Hook Rebellion that the CIA and Magsaysay had to pacify. And successfully they did. They portrayed him as he was an auto mechanic. He had to work as a chauffeur to finance his way through college, and he was an ordinary guy, not crass, not vulgar, not like Duterte, but just an ordinary guy who loves walking in the street so that people could tear away his barong Tagalog. And I was one of them. I was 10 years old. I tore away one of his a piece of his barong Tagalog. But the United States and he himself did not go on to try and be authoritarian. I don't know what would have happened had he not died in a plane crash, but up to that point, he was just a man of the masses, popular, but not a would-be dictator. And the reason for that is the United States was deep into the Cold War. And its involvement in Vietnam was beginning to escalate. And it needed, again, to strengthen the image of the Philippines as the showcase of democracy in Asia, as a cultural and ideological buffer against Asian communism. So that's why it couldn't then encourage anyone, including Magsaysay, to be more like a dictator. That would be against the image that we were trying to develop. Besides, the local rebellion, the Hook Rebellion, they'd already defeated. So there was no need for, more high-handed policies. I think what Marcos did was that he caught the United States government in the growing area, so to speak, because by the time Marcos was president, the United States involvement in Vietnam was also highly dependent on the role of the Philippines as a staging area for military operations in Vietnam. So Clark Air Base, Subic Naval Base, more than 70 other installations. Mactan was developed as another base to attack in Vietnam, in Cambodia, and Laos. So, and then also the rise of a new nationalism, the rise of a new rebellion, a new revolutionary movement led by the Communist Party of the Philippines, unrest in the cities. So the United States really had to figure out, I think Marcos saw an opening, and the United States just let him, even bolstered him, because he didn't want to endanger its military position in the region. And that's my explanation for why, with such a long history of authoritarian, strongman kind of political culture, it was only Marcos that came up as a dictator, which doesn't necessarily mean that you'll be the last. So then this is where the current danger to democracy comes in, because when Marcos was overthrown, what the Cory Aquino government did was to restore a democratic arrangement, and even improved upon it a little bit, so that the new constitution allows, for example, for marginalized sectors, even left-wing formations, to win seats in Congress and participate in the legislature. Freedom of the press was restored, freedom of assembly. A commission on human rights was established. That arrangement had survived several coup attempts, military coup attempts. Do you remember it survived the scandalous corruption of Joseph Estrada, similarly scandalous corruption of Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, even the bunglings of the younger Aquino president. But I'm not sure it's going to survive the Duterte administration, because not only of his appeal, but the impunity with which his cabinet members seem to be weaponizing their positions against political enemies, against human rights advocates. Even now linking the Human Rights Commission and Human Rights Watch to drug dealers or drug pushers, saying that they're unwittingly being used by drug pushers. So it's all a very dangerous situation where you could be linked as a drug figure and be eliminated. It's trying to change the Constitution, which people felt that there's no real need of changing it except to improve it, but they're changing it so that the Philippines will become a federal republic. Now there's popular appeal for federalism because historically the national budget had been unfairly redistributed to the areas, far-flung areas. So naturally there's an appeal for give us more resources. And the answer that Duterte is giving to that is federate the Philippines, which seems logical, but only if you forget the fact that if you federate the Philippines, all the local dynasties and oligarchs will then have a monopoly of the regions. So this is what's going on. There's a battle between people who want to maintain a democratic arrangement and an administration that seems to be bent on strong manning its way for another arrangement, which would be authoritarian and dictatorial. So we'll just stop there.
So I'll talk about the activity that has arisen within the Filipino-American community across the U.S. in response to the developments with the advent of the presidency of Rodrigo Duterte. So as you know, Duterte is popular in the Philippines. He delivers a populist message. He talks differently from the other Harvard-educated elite politicians, and so he's capturing the imagination of the Filipino people, including Filipinos here are actually open to supporting him. And the most negative developments have not yet transpired as a result of the tendencies of the Duterte administration. So the Filipino community here is not yet totally opposed. I mean, the most drastic consequences has been the killings of drug addicts, tens of thousands of drug addicts. But even in Manila, you know, if you live in certain enclaves in Manila, you're not so close to that. So the whole notion of protecting human rights and due process is not even really well embraced yet. We're not yet at the point where, you know, suddenly during the Marcos era, over 2 million Filipinos spilled into the streets. There's no such outrage. There's no immediate perception by the Filipino people that this is a bad government. Mm-hmm. There is, however, opposition here, and who's opposing Duterte here, creating as much as possible an alternative educational message to the community that something wrong is going on there. For the most part, it's composed of people who have been active against the Marcos dictatorship in the past. These people are a little bit getting old. but the moment they heard about Duterte,
Like wine.
But the moment they heard about Duterte, even before he assumed office, he was already starting to kill drug addicts. Drug addicts continued to escalate in their deaths after the election. All of his inappropriate remarks about women, his offensiveness around that, his criticism, his wild, you know, actions and responses to concerns from international human rights bodies, including, you know, President Obama. All of this was creating concern, of course. But the triggering action, that the first action where everybody got together was when President Duterte facilitated the burial of the dictator in the Hero Cemetery, Ferdinand Marcos. That was the turning point where a lot of people, us oldies, you know, from, for example, the former members of the Movement for a Free Philippines, the Nina Aquino movement. More lately, there was a group that formed under the U.S. Pinoys for Good Governance that involved a rich Filipino-American, Loida Nicolas Luis, who was subsequently actually targeted by the Duterte administration. Former members of the Katipunan ng mga Democratic Filipino, former members, and also we came together also with members, younger members, predominantly younger members of the groups like Gabriela Anak Bayan, who are more associated with the left in the Philippines. So we all actually got together during that time and organized nationwide protests, I think in LA, New York, various cities. So that was the first coming together, and it was subsequent to that, because of that coming together, there were certain formations or certain groups of people that continued to be active in different cities. For example, in San Francisco here, a Filipino Human Rights Alliance was constituted that continued to raise concern in various ways and doing various activities to try to educate and raise the issue of what's happening there. The main concerns have been the burial represented a concern around revising history to try to paint that picture that dictatorship as maybe it wasn't too bad. There's a lot of bad repercussions for that because Duterte seems to be headed in that direction. So to portray the dictatorship of Marcos as they actually did good, they built roads, is softening the ground for a Duterte, takeover. It's also softening the ground for the personal ambitions of the Marcos family. There's now currently attempts to steal the legitimately won vice presidency position that Bongbong Marcos, the son of the dictator, lost. And he's trying to question that and trying to steal that by raising a protest with the Commission on Elections. And I think the ballots are getting recounted, and we're all worried that who knows who he's paid or how this is all going to unfold. There's also concern because there's a tight alliance between Duterte and the Marcos family. So the Marcos family apparently financed, his campaign to the tune of a lot of money, and he's been kowtowing to them. Federalism, the concern of that too was it might be used as a way to perpetuate, Duterte in power. Duterte has been trying to shoot trial balloons about wanting to stay in power. He tried to say, maybe martial law is a good thing. Maybe I should declare martial law not just in Mindanao but throughout the whole country. He tried that. Then he said, well, I don't need to do martial law. I'll do revolutionary government, just like Corazon Aquino did. Because after Marcos fell, Aquino basically said, this is a revolutionary situation. We're not going to follow the Constitution. This is a revolutionary government. So he was also bandying that about, yeah. And so there's fears that he's positioning himself to take power over. There's also immediate concerns even now that he's not yet a dictator, that he's manipulating and causing travesty in the justice system, where he's manipulating trumped-up charges, making up lies, pursuing prosecutions against his opponents, to the point where a senator, Laila de Lima, has been jailed, and charges are always being threatened. And the Justice Secretary is making up all sorts of lies and allegations. So these are all of concern to this group of people that have organized ourselves here. And we're trying to, at this point in time, really it's digging in for the long haul. And I think the perspective is that we can't just be silent just because he's so powerful. We can't not raise the issues. And so the way it's been raised has been through various ways. A bill was sponsored in the U.S. Senate. I think it's 1055. It's called the Philippine Human Rights Accountability Act, that is conditioning the continued receipt of defense equipment and services, military defense, to the government, conditioned upon demonstrated improvements in human rights. That bill is still sitting in the Senate. It doesn't yet have a House sponsor, but there's lobbying that needs to be done and is in the minds of the people who are active. There's also speakers that have come here. For example, Raisa Robles, who wrote this book. What's the title of the book?
Oh, Never Again.
Never Again, yeah, which really is a great, book that reminded everybody what martial law was. And it's a bestseller, very acclaimed book. And we toured her around several cities in the U.S. We also brought Susan Kimpo, who's a member of a family, I think 10 of whom joined the struggle against Marcos, a couple of whom were killed as a result. And their family also wrote a book called Subversive Lives. And again, it's a way to combat the attempts to revise the history of that era. She's coming again, actually, and they have a project in Manila to try to reach out to young people to tell the story of what it was like back then. We've also brought sponsored speakers, like there's a senator in the Philippines, Antonio Trillanes, who is very vocal and effective, actually, in his opposition. And he's been here. We organized a panel for him, a forum for him here in San Francisco, as well as in Los Angeles. So those kinds of activities are happening. Akbayan Youth is also a group in the Philippines associated with the Akbayan party list. We also brought them here for speaking engagements. So in general, it's a concern around impunity. It's a concern around violation of human rights. It's a concern about the threat to usurp democracy in the Philippines. So that's what the groups are doing.
And just to cap that in terms of the strategic interest of Filipino-American community in keeping up with Philippine events and taking the correct position on the issues that are taking place. Similar to the time when Marcos was ruling, it was very important for activists here to make sure that the dictatorship could not claim hegemony over the loyalty of the Filipino-American community. That was done through demonstrations, lobbying, organizing the community. It was very important because Marcos was dependent on U.S. military and economic aid. So that had he been able to claim hegemony over the Filipino-American community's sentiments, it would have been easier for him to sail through every time Congress had to deliberate on continued aid. The other strategic interest of the Filipino-American community is the profile of the Filipino community improved when people power overthrew Marcos. Suddenly, Filipinos everywhere, including here, found due pride that they were able to do this for the interest of democracy. So it would not be good for our collective profile if the Philippines continues to be known as an economic basket case, which is no longer the case, is beginning to improve, but a political, madhouse. What would that say of all Filipinos in general? So that's why the question is always implicit when I'm asked, or we're asked, what's happening in the Philippines? What's this guy Duterte? The question really is, what's the matter with you guys? So that's our strategic interest for why we need to start developing the opposition to the authoritarianism that's developing in the Philippines.
I think just a couple of quick points. The significance of the Filipino-American community voice is raised by a couple of incidents that have happened. One is that there was an allegation actually by the Duterte administration that there was a Filipino-American plot to overthrow his government. And then the other thing too is if you navigate the trolls in the if you encounter them in the internet, anytime we have a Filipino-American event, Filipino-Americans are castigated as you're not Filipinos anymore. what the hell are you intervening in our, we're no longer Filipinos, you know, shut up. So it casts, because of the activity of opposition, Filipino-Americans are being cast in a negative and sinister light. That's the tactic of the Duterte administration.
So then, just to add, because what we learned also in during the Marcos period, the importance of organizing in the Filipino, but broader than the Filipino community, because we feel that the summation of the Marcos dictatorship for the majority of the broader American public has been institutionalized, even though there is a younger generation that knows nothing about the Marcos dictatorship because it was so many years ago, and people don't learn about history, their own history, much less history of other countries. But it's important to utilize that broader American condemnation of what's happening in the Philippines and to unite with those in the Filipino community that are trying to do that education work about the Duterte government and to put pressure based on that. You know, I do want to also raise that there is a very, you know, the rumors is that the use of social networking to promote Duterte's popularity, as well as to cleanse the history of the Marcos dictatorship, and to win the Duterte presidential election. That was constructed by a man called Paul Manafort, a name that has become very familiar, but was very well connected to the Marcoses themselves during that period of time. He also was brought in to work on the Duterte presidential election. And as if you're reading the papers now, the Philippines was used somewhat as a test case for the power of social networking and trolls. And that was obvious during, and fake news. So that is a signature piece of the Trump administration. And Manafort, you know, has been indicted for the work that he's done in terms of in the Trump election, and is the main person that's being indicted for you know, the defeat of his work in the election and defeat of Hillary Clinton and the use of social networking and fake news. So there's a very deep connection between, you know, what the role of that social networking, fake news, and Manafort being the key person that would connect the Marcoses, Duterte, and then the election of Trump. And, you know, the difference, you know, I mean, we're all disgruntled about what's happening here in this country. We have our own set of problems, so that's why people should never criticize what's happening in other countries, because many of us wondered, how could Trump get elected? And you know, that happened here, even though he has now the lowest rating of any president that has ever been elected, and in every category, Trump's popularity has dropped, including white, middle class, upper middle class, white men. So we wanted to open it up for discussion.
I had a comment, because precisely, I mean, the question that
Rene
had about when people ask what's happening, what is it about the Filipinos, and you recognize it's not about the Filipinos. It's about American colonial rule from the very beginning. I mean, the policing structures of the Americans at the beginning are just replicated in the structure. So I think it's really important in terms of the organizing for Filipinos, Filipino-Americans, is to really combat that concept that is a Filipinism, it's a nativism. It is not, it's structural. It's structural, that has to do with the Filipino-American War and how it was policed. It's structural that has to do with the the constitution that was set up, which is a military, the executive of the 1935 constitution was not light. It was a very strong executive that had military power because the American Governor General was still in charge. And so, and I think that issue, the question that you have, the people asking us, what is it about the Filipinos? What is it about American imperial structure that has created this business? And I think that's really important. And the other thing is the Twitter stuff. It was so clear by the time the Manafort stuff came out that that wow, the Philippines was the ground for that shit.
Yeah.
And for us to recognize that Duterte, okay, so great, he has this weird vulgar mouth, et cetera. People say that's like a Filipino thing. I really don't think so. I don't think Duterte would have won without that Twitter, without the money behind him, the Marcos money behind him. That is Manafort, that is all of these, that is actually a mirror of the Trump stuff. So it's not, I think we have to really push back on this notion of the Filipino as authoritarian. Because as you know, as you pointed out, the stuff, the actual prehistoric stuff, we don't really see traces of that.
Yeah.
But we see it in the imperial structures, in the colonized structures, we see it in the capitalist structures of America, and we really need to push back on the Filipino as this strong man, broken.
Yes.
I really don't think so. And part of the vote for Duterte was in some ways weirdly liberatory because they were going against the corrupt governments. They were really going against the oligarchic governments.
Yes.
They were misled. It was a misframing as Duterte being the savior. But we have to understand that that vote of the Filipino for Duterte was not like the stupid racist vote of the Americans
Yes.
for Trump.
Yeah.
It was a weirdly anti-oligarchic, liberatory, even somewhat left.
Yes.
Because remember, the left was trying to be with Duterte. So I think we really need to push back on the stupid business of Filipinos as authoritarian, strongman, nativist weirdos. We are not.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I agree with you, but we also cannot deny that there are certain things in the political culture as a result of colonialism.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We offered
Yeah.
that. But I think colonialism needs to be
Yeah.
up front and
Yeah.
center in that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm also kind of annoyed that people in the Philippines think Filipino descendants are not affected by what happens in the Philippines. We just like, oh, all our family is not there anymore.
Yeah.
Oh, you know what I mean? Like, it's like, wait, like, what are you talking about?
right.
You know, I do research with Filipinos, asking them their, you know, about their, you know, what do you think about Duterte? And because I'm from Mindanao, they assume I'm for Duterte. So it's kind of interesting because like I just won't say my political opinion, so to engage people's like political affiliations. So I'll wait at the end and then I'll say I'm from Mindanao, and then all the they should kill all the poor people, and I'm like, what? I mean, it's really good data, but it's really frightening that they assume, even though I haven't lived in the Philippines in like 14 years, they're like, of course you're for Duterte because you're from Davao. So even though I haven't, I've never lived in the Philippines long. Now officially I've lived in the US longer than the Philippines. And it's still, to this day, people assume I'm a crazy Duterte supporter because I'm from Davao and I have no choice in that, right? Or when during the election, my Facebook feed was just all Duterte. And they just assume like, and they're tagging me. And I'm like, what the, like, why are you tagging me in this? Like, there's this assumption that, and I was at a FONT conference and this woman was like, oh, you're from Mindanao. And she just slapped a Duterte sticker on my hand, not asking me. She just went and I was like, no, but it's okay. She's like, no. And she just put it on my hand. And I'm like, thank you for asking me my opinions on this. You know what I mean? Like, it really bothers me when people assume that people who live in the Philippines, we don't care. We don't live there anymore, so we don't care.
Well, we actually, in connection with our book, we actually did 2 forums in the beginning of February at the University of the Philippines in Manila, and got crowds of over 100 people, many of them young people. But most people don't know about the history of organizing in the Filipino community here around the Philippines.
Right.
And so they were very, unfortunately our book was too expensive for people to buy, and we're trying to get it published there. But they are very, very interested in that history.
Well, that one bookstore didn't publish that.
So I think it's important to keep the dialogue open about, about transnational organizing and why it's important. What is international solidarity? And to educate also people in the Philippines that we have a long history of organizing that goes back to the 30s and the 40s when the Monum generation who were involved in union organizing never forgot where they came from, even though they never went home. If you look at the famous yearbook, the 1957 yearbook that Carlos Bulasan wrote for the Alaska Cannery Workers Union, it had articles about what was happening in the Philippines and the Hope Rebellion. So that history is there, it's just not known in the Philippines as well.
I interviewed like third, fourth generation Filipinos in New York, and they're still talking about the Philippines. Their great grandparents were from the Philippines, and they're still like, oh, like I went to the Philippines last year. So it's like, it's so frustrating to me. Like, we're still connected.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I was wondering how much of this narrative of framing the Duterte followers as the Dutertards, right, is fueling this their movement and against Duterte.
Yeah,
Also.
it says.
So I think that's what she was talking about. These colonial legacies, they are very much active, and the Filipinos othering this process of othering.
Very regional.
Well,
you can
there's-
totally draw parallels in between, like how Clinton framed
The
Trump's
deplorables,
followers
right,
as
deplorables,
deplorables, right?
Yeah.
Deplorables.
It's the Dutertards versus the Dilawan.
Yeah, yellow tard.
Dilawan are the
Exactly.
the Dilawan are the yellowers, whatever. From the Koreakino, it's yellow. So that anyone who criticizes Duterte must be connected with the Liberal Party, the Yellows. And anyone connected with or supportive of Duterte are Dutertards. Yeah, that's the divide.
The concerning thing about that dynamic, the frame, the name yellow tards, because it
The Dutertards.
I'm actually talking about first of all, the word yellow tards is like a blanket aspersion that's cast on anybody who opposes. And there's two attributes to that. One is it's an anti-elite sentiment that says yellow tards. But the danger also is that it's also a diminution of the people power overthrow of the dictator, and so it diminishes the significance of the importance of liberalism and the human rights and democratic processes, and that's part of the danger of this blanket casting of yellow tard to anybody who opposes Aquino.
And of course, the use of the tard means reference to retarded,
Right.
which is an insult to people with mental health problems. So it's all this backwardness coming to the forefront. So.
Thank you for the presentation. What I find really interesting about this moment now, at least, is that there is this new coalition, I think, of activists who are going together against fascism as an idea, as an experience. So we have activists like you who were at the forefront, of anti-Marcos organizing, and then there are young people now who are organizers, who identify as left, radical left, however you want to understand it, and they are making these connections to this history of the Marcos regime, and recognizing parallels between Marcos and Duterte. But it's not just even parallels. There are absolute connections. Duterte unapologetically, categorically stated Amy Marcos was the only one who supported me, right? When I was working his sense of loyalty to the Marcoses comes from his father. His father working with the Marcoses early on in the 1960s. But no mention of mom.
Yeah,
Mom. Cory, very solid Cory Aquino supporter. And again, this is still part of the criticism that was mentioned by Gina Apostol, right? That there has to be a conversation about how Duterte, in the early part, he was attractive for the left in the Philippines.
Right.
Right? And they wanted to support him because Duterte said, he said he was a socialist, right? And there was something promising about that. There was also this rejection of the oligarchy represented by Mar Rojas, because his great-grandfather was a president of the Philippine Republic, right? So I think that when people were gravitating to Duterte, he's very canny, he's very smart, he's very manipulative.
The Manafort people were very canny.
Right, absolutely, of course, absolutely.
Not
But
two,
both of them, right?
They used that shit.
So he was. This is a man who knows how to use people. He knew how to use the left in Davao. He knew how to use the death squads, right? He knew how to work with the millionaires in Davao, which is why he has Sonny Dominguez on as his finance minister,
Secretary.
right? This is a man who Tony Boy Polanco?
Florendo.
Oh, I'm sorry, Tony Boy. Yeah, okay.
Because they're rivals, they were markets.
Business and business
I see.
interests. Business
So
interests.
there's that. He's very good as a politician, very clever, and then but behind clever, he has a structure behind it.
That's what we really need to
We
keep
need
seeing.
to
There's
keep-
a structure behind this shit.
And the structure is Manafort, millions of dollars.
It's not Marcos.
It's
Marcos.
Marcos,
Yeah.
Manafort. It's
See that, if we can figure out how to make it very clear that the Manafort stuff, the Twitter bots is Marcos money. Once we get that, I think that'll be good.
That'll be solid for
I don't know,
organizing.
Inquirer.net, I don't know if journalists that you know are looking into this.
They are actually more and more. There are more and more exposures of this Twitter factory.
Yes.
Well, I know. I don't know who's funding. It's not clear who's funding it, but it's clear that Bongbong has his own army of trolls. Duterte used a particular troll that I met with in the Philippines. I forgot his name though.
But there's several of them.
Well, but this one really even came out in the press. Yeah, he was interviewed by the international media and said, we built up this troll army for Duterte. He was asking, I was campaigning for somebody who didn't win as senator, Walden Bayo.
Yeah.
And I spoke to this guy, and he says, well, if you have 20 million pesos, I can assure you that Walden will be on the internet every hour of the day. I thought you were going to donate your time to us, but so that was his business, and he was used to be part of the left.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Can I make a comment around this whole critical issue of alliances and how do we counter fascism? Because I think one of our critiques of the left in the Philippines is that they don't actually their distinguishment between oligarchic democracy and fascism is weak. It's weak. For them, it's almost like those two things are the same thing. So their ability to ally with all forces that can be allied with in order to prevent an outright fascist takeover is compromised by the fact that for them, an oligarchic democracy with elections, with human rights, is the same as a dictatorship. And so this manifested even during the Marcos era, when they were actually the Cory era, when they couldn't understand that a new era has arisen where there's now a formal democracy, and they were as intent in undermining, in the middle of all of the coup attempts, they were as intent in undermining the Corazon government as they were the Marcos government. So the left has a certain blinder.
Well, but the left is a big, it's not one.
I'm just talking about the CPP, the Communist Party.
I see.
Right.
So you're talking about the communist underground.
Mhm.
All right, so like that's
Yeah.
clear.
Except that the communist underground has an above ground that also.
Right.
It's an ambiguous, interlocking,
Right.
interdependent, but also separate set of.
Right.
It's a very interesting structure that they have.
Right.
Because in order to be public and be part, actually, of participatory democracy, they have these, but of course, if you're public and part of participatory, you're not
Yeah.
gonna say that you're also a
Right.
communist.
Yeah.
Well, this is the thing, because
Yeah.
the new constitution, actually, the Communist Party, illegal under Marcos, became legal after Marcos was overthrown. They were given legal, recognized that they don't need to go underground essentially, okay, because they could be in the open. But it's the strategy is people's war for the long term. And I think Edwin was essentially describing the view of the CPP that, for example, during the snap election called by Marcos, and Cory Aquino and the opposition, traditional opposition, ran against him, that was just a fight between our ruling class enemies. Okay. So they utilize. Sure, it might have been, could have been, it probably was, but refused to utilize the conflict between the two factions.
Yeah, there was a split there.
Yeah, in the favor of the democratic forces, but calling for a boycott.
Yeah.
So that therefore, it was not part of the broad attempt of people power to overthrow Marcos. And when that became successful, then it couldn't become part of the reshaping
Sure, yeah.
of
They
of
were
what
sort of-
company, right? So they were marginalized politically.
The party did that thing, I don't know when they did it, but the rectification, where they actually admitted that that there were all these errors, and they had like a paper about rectifying and.
Oh, let me
recognizing.
explain that. The
Yeah.
rectification, okay. What they said, it was a tactical error. When the critics within the CPP were saying it was a strategic error, you could have shared in political power with Cory because she was open to it.
Yeah, it was a huge.
Yeah. So then the rectification essentially is to go back to the basics, which is forget all these newfangled ideas that were being introduced by the dissidents within the party. This insurrection, use of the democratic space, all these ideas. Go back to the basics of people's war. And that's where they still are. And in fact, they're still going by the strategy that was written 50 years ago. An analysis of the Philippines that is 50 years old, as if nothing had changed. So if you're locked into that kind of analysis and view, you're going to keep continuing your mistakes. So, like I saw an interview of this guy, one commander, on the anniversary of the Communist Party of the Philippines in December. And he says, we've been fighting for 50 years, and we will keep fighting for 50 years more if necessary. So, okay, good. That's very determined. You can applaud the determination of that statement, but there's no strategic optimism of when can this actually be done. You need to be able to tell people, this is what we intend to do, and then, hopefully within this certain period of time, we'll be able to have state power at least if you're a communist, and then we'll proceed with the social reform. But 50 years, 100 years, that's not very optimistic.
I don't need to, I understand that there's the underground left that will continue with the people People's War.
Mhm.
What I was saying was what I find promising, what I find
Mhm.
optimistic,
Yeah.
is this, you know, historical imagination now that's happening, that
Mhm.
there are young people here,
Oh, definitely.
you know, who
And in the
are,
Philippines. And in the Philippines
and
too.
in the Philippines, exactly. I mean, I think maybe Edwin would be unhappy about this, but there are young people in Manila who think that, you know, they really don't agree with liberal democracy. They think that liberal democracy has failed the Filipino people, the peasants and the workers.
Right.
You know, if we're going to have democracy just the same, just the way it has been
Mhm.
with, you know, other politicians, we don't want that.
Mhm.
I find it promising that there is this aspiration to let's think of another way.
I'm not unhappy about that.
Oh,
My problem is that, and I marched with the black-clad people in Manila last September what anniversary of martial law.
Mhm.
There were thousands in the streets, and out of convenience, I joined the march of the the underground left, not underground, but the university students. I was inspired seeing them. The problem is not whether you're critical of liberal democracy, because we all are. The problem is, do you find any difference between a government of Noynoy Aquino and a dictatorship by Duterte? Is there any difference in your mind? That's really the critical question. Because if there is a difference, then you will form an alliance with everybody who can be allied with to oppose Duterte, including allying with somebody like Noynoy. That's really the crux of the matter.
I think if that happens, that would be
yeah.
good, I think, because that's what it would be.
Yes, please.
I just want to add to, I was with Marisa in summer 2016 after Duterte was elected, and I was struck by some conversations that I had with people who were local and who were working at the university at Silliman, and they were pro Duterte, and a lot of their criticism was that they saw Duterte as a socialist, but they also saw him as an anti-imperialist, which I thought was really interesting. These people were vehemently anti-American imperialism, and they also, and one of the things that they, and I know that this is urgent reason, but one of the things that they said continually, they referred to Manila as Imperial Manila, and so they saw Duterte arriving in Manila as equivalent to or analogous to Trump arriving in Washington to drain the swamp, right? So, and then questions as well about economics came up, you know, that Duterte they saw him as being socialist and anti-imperialist because he was going to get rid of the neoliberal economic structure that they saw as maintaining this imperial Manila. So, you know, so how, again, this was coming from the left, right? This is coming from, and these were as well coming from those who were religious, but they were kind of like,
So they're very confused.
they were like Marxists. Yeah, they were confused, so how in the same way that I've heard people like Cornel West refer to Trump's elections, like now we even for all that Trump says that he's anti-globalization, right? He wants to get rid of NAFTA. He wants to start a trade war, but that it's really going to continue with neoliberalism, but it's going to be neoliberalism on steroids, right? So how do we also understand economics within this, and also that in relation to, I mean, because I very much agree with what Gina is saying, and also Marisa, that we have to look at how this is very much embedded in the whole history of the American colonial structure that that has been implemented. If anything, he's continuing that those politics and that work of colonization, right? But at the same time, maintaining this authoritarianism against globalization, against but also continuing with it. So it's really complicated that way.
Well, yeah, it's the format versus the essence, So Duterte deep down knows that he really can't sever ties with the United States. The United States is still the biggest trading partner of the top investor in the Philippines. Japan is the first trading partner, being replaced by China fast. And I think, something has to be said about, even though the Philippines was a colony and the United States had advisors in Malacanang, the palace, even as late as the 60s, there's already part of the development is the development of a quasi-independence of Philippine politics from U.S. Manipulation. I mean, I don't really think that everything that happens in the Philippines is determined in Washington, D.C., put it that way. There is room for maneuver. And that's why Duterte can get away with his statements against the United States, being anti-imperialist, while not really being so. Also, the United States is quite in a quandary because when it retreated from Southeast Asia after its defeat in Vietnam, China begins to step in, begins to make the South China Sea as a Chinese lake. And the United States is trying to get back in there. This China pivot, or the Asian pivot is part of that. And Duterte is kind of leaning towards China. It looks like anti-imperialist on the one hand, but giving up Philippine sovereignty to China. Even joking that you should just make us a province. Remember that joke?
Yeah.
To the local Chinese, just make us a province. So it's really form and substance. You're right. He's also being friendly to Russia.
Oh, he loves Russia.
Okay, here's where the Manafort thing comes in again,
Yeah, exactly.
right? But he really can't fully break away from the United States at this point. It's still the relationship is still too dependent, economically, and militarily. The Philippine military as an institution was shaped in the U.S. image.
Absolutely.
So the Philippine military always defers instinctively to American political positions.
It's also trained by them.
Yeah, trained by them too. So that Duterte has to be very careful. And I think that's why he suddenly stopped the negotiations with the CPP. I think it's because of pressure from the military that's a very dangerous place to go.
You mean the Philippine?
Philippine military.
The
Yeah.
Philippine military.
Yeah. So Duterte is has the strongest support in the Philippine National Police, the PNP. We used to be the Philippine Constabulary. But the armed forces itself, the army, he knows it's very difficult to keep even the left rhetoric.
He started toning it down.
They started toning it down.
You're right.
He started being more anti-NPA.
Yes.
Shoot the
Shoot
NPA
them in the
girls in the vagina.
vagina.
Stuff like that.
Yeah.
It's all fed to the Philippine military.
Absolutely.
Um,
Explaining it to the military.
yeah.
Absolutely.
So
I have two questions. One related to ask Rene if you would be able to outline the role of the American colonial government in the facilitation of the creation of the oligarchic structure that we see in a little bit more
Okay.
detail to see that. So that's the first question. The second is about how to reach our families, people in our community who aren't Duterte supporters, but are very distrustful of any kind of information. Where do we direct them and ourselves for information? For people who are empathetic but are afraid to take a position because they don't know what statistics to trust.
Okay, I answered that first question. The second question is that the Philippine press, Philippine media in the Philippines is still, I think, for the most part, reliable. So that they should start it will not give them kind of like conclusions. But it will give them reports of day-to-day happenings that where they can read between the lines, or that the media is still reporting on let's say, stuff like the top drug lords have been charged. A number of them are Chinese, being charged with drug trading. First of all, they were not killed. One of them even had a meeting with Duterte. Then 2 weeks ago, the charges were mysteriously dropped. You know, and so these things they can still get from the U.S. From the Philippine media. You know.
Okay, so even statistics,
Yeah.
because that's the major question I see. Like, how do we know that the numbers are so large?
The Philippine National
Yeah.
Police actually, they actually give the facts.
Okay,
They
here's
interpret them in a
yeah.
particular way.
The latest interpretation, however, has come from human rights people, because
Yeah.
it is the thing. As a reporter in the Philippines, it used to be very easy to get daily police data of arrests and deaths in police action. So up to February last year, journalists could still get that. But when the extrajudicial killings took place, it started becoming an issue, the police suddenly started, like putting a lot of red tape for you to get that information. So the human rights people said, okay, if the average monthly killings up to February from the beginning of his term were this much, then we extrapolate the months that we couldn't get the reports. So that's how they came up with 20,000. You know, it's probably less, but they just base it on the averages, previous averages.
Rene, actually, they think
It's more.
My contact from Human Rights Watch said that if the police are saying it's 20,000
Police
deaths,
are saying
it's underreported. It's actually even more frightening. And sorry,
So are the police saying 20,000?
The police are saying
Human Rights
20,000
Watch.
dead, but 3,000 that were
That's-
released.
That's
Yeah,
it. Yeah.
yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
and
Yeah.
that figure, that's
Yeah.
where the questions
Yeah,
arise
yeah.
with the people that I speak
Yeah.
to.
So then the first question you had is about the U.S. colonialism and the development of this local elite. Actually, even before U.S. colonialism came in, even before the Filipino-American War, the new revolutionary government of the Philippines led by Aguinaldo, right? It started to form a national government. And the thinking was, from this class of people, was that we have to present to the world a respectable line of leaders, nationally and locally. So that there's an important book by Mila Guerrero on this in the Philippines. So what happens is that even though different, let's say, local areas, for example, a local area would have a revolutionary leader, the people followed. They were not necessarily given the official government position because they may have been uneducated. So they wanted the Aguinaldo government wanted mainly the ones that could present a respectable, either landowning and or educated, so that the local government will be somebody respectable. So it began there. So that's why from the very beginning you had already corruption embedded in the rising new government structure. Then when the Americans came, after the defeat of the Filipinos during the Filipino-American War, the Americans consolidated that and developed that further. So that these non-revolutionary Filipinos began occupying, and their families started dynastic occupations of government positions. So that's as far as I could go. But for detail, which was really interesting, how the cacique class developed, was Mila Guerrero's War in Luzon. That's the title of the book, War in Luzon. And you could see how Rene Ciria, the governor chosen by Aguinaldo, this guy, he was not the revolutionary leader. You know, it's like. Yeah.
To answer your question, I also went to a class of Philippine Studies at City College. I
Mhm.
don't remember the professor's name, but it's
Mike Gonzalez. Mike Gonzalez?
No.
No?
But he said that the U.S. brought Filipino young men over to the Northeast, which is a pattern that they brought from Hawaii. They also brought.
These are pensionados. They call the
That's the
pensionados.
system. Yeah.
So these were not necessarily all from the rich classes. Some of them are from the middle classes. Most of them are from the middle classes, educated, and they're mainly trained for the bureaucracy. You know, department heads, you know. But the president, senators, they're all culled from the elite. Yeah.
Can I add, I mean, apart from Rene Guerrero, who's an excellent historian, Alfred McCoy's book, of course, Policing the Empire, Paul Kramer's work on the blood of government, these are go-tos. Whenever you need to know anything about American colonial rule, these are two historians I always go to.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about how organizing has changed in the face of social media for everyone, and to counter the trolls in Facebook and Twitter as well. So we know now there's been this concerted effort, millions of dollars put in, invested for the campaigns for Bongbong, potentially in the future for Duterte to have been elected for Trump. Who are the players opposing them, and how are they using the same type of machinations to have the anti-messages go through?
Do you know anything about this?
Not on that level. I just know how I use social media to organize these days. But on that level of the trolls and the bots and the shaping of public opinion, I don't know whether there's a counter effort by our side.
On a similar scale.
On a similar scale, yeah.
We
And
just
of course,
we don't have the
Yeah,
money.
just the difference between organizing then and organizing now. During the Marcos era, we had to send our newspapers through Greyhound. We had to dictate our leaflets long distance, because there was no email, there was no Dropbox. Yeah, so that's very different. And then, of course, social media as a whole opens up a whole new animal that we're still trying to people are still trying to figure out what problems it poses for democracy. That's Zuckerberg is in big trouble trying to figure, and stuff like that. So it's really a difficult, a new arena to explore.
And there's ethics around that, right? So probably on our side, we won't employ fake news, right? We'll at least tell the truth.
Yeah.
But even if we're telling the truth, there's ways of amplifying, the message that is that ethical or not. There's a way where how do they do it? Where the bots replicate the message and it multiplies. So even if you're telling the truth, it just gets out there in mass.
Yeah, I don't mean countering misinformation with more misinformation.
Yeah.
I mean taking lessons from it, like taking lessons from the Tea Party or from and bringing it to the left.
Yes.
And try to mobilize people that way.
Yeah.
I read a book by somebody who participated in the Sanders campaign, and there are technologies that software and apps on your phone where you can actually organize in a fast way, where you actually use the networking capabilities, where you actually let loose and people take it up. You're not controlling everybody. It's not going to be the communist way of organizing where you control everybody. You let them loose and they create their own in different pockets of the country.
Well, the labor movement in this country is confronted with a deep crisis, not only because of the abandonment of working class towards unionizing, but as well as a major Supreme Court decision that's coming down, the Jan's decision. And so I'm a member of the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance. And so what they are calling for is a return to grassroots organizing, to do one-on-one work, to educate workers about, the importance of unions. I mean, they will use certain technologies in terms of social networking, email to reach people, but they said they must now go back to the old style of organizing, of going door to door, talking one-on-one with workers to make sure that they're educated about, unionization, about certain decisions that are being made to dismantle the labor movement. So, I mean, I think that we need to think about that as well as the Philippines, because we will never have the money to compete with those that are controlling the trolls and the social networking, and we have to do that one-on-one work too.
To give you an example, we had a meeting with the Filipino-American Human Rights Alliance one time, and this person from LA who had worked in a political campaign in the Philippines for Senator Poe, Grace Poe, said, if you have $10,000, I can set up for you a private server somewhere in Eastern Europe, so that every time you have a message, it automatically goes to millions of people. But it would require $10,000 to set that up. So probably commission for himself included, but that's how much it would cost. And if you're thinking of real big time organizing, it's really just prohibitive for people who kind of like, what do we do, bake sales?
You can imagine the billions that Marcos has.
Oh yeah,
Oh, yeah.
definitely.
You can't find it.
Yeah.
There is another network before the Sanders campaign. Do you guys remember in the Bay Area, this guy with a Greek name, Marcos Markolakopoulos? It's called Netroots Nation. They meet every summer. They did Detroit, Phoenix. This summer is New Orleans. And they have the political connection. Bernie Sanders was in Phoenix. Elizabeth Warren always comes. And then there's an interesting, is he a senator, a congressman, Chris Murphy? I think he's Connecticut, but he's interested in changing foreign policy. And he comes. So it's Netroots Nation. And a lot of people are Bay Area people. Yeah, and they have an API caucus. Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
You have to do discussion,
Yes,
Yeah.
we are.